Our speakers today are Randy Estabrook, QCP Executive Director, Wayne Hintz, QCP Program Manager, and Greg Parham, QCP Inspections Manager. Welcome, Randy, Wayne, and Greg. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today. I will pass the floor over to you.
Thank you, Cameron, for getting us up and running yet once again. This is Wayne Hintz. Hope all of you are doing well. Thanks for taking some of your valuable and I'm sure all too scarce time to attend this afternoon. I'm going to give you just a little background on what we're going to cover today. In December 2014, we presented a webinar called Steering Clear, Avoiding Common Errors in QCP Certified Projects. Some of you may remember that webinar. And that presentation basically had two parts. The first part discussed a couple of QCP administrative and procedural requirements that our licensee companies typically encounter during the course of a certified project, and Greg offered advice on how to successfully navigate those requirements. And then secondly, we listed the 10 features in product fabrication and job site installation, which were at that time the most commonly reported by QCP inspectors as failing to conform to the architectural wood standards. And by the way, for this webinar, we'll use the term AWS when we're referring to the standards. In today's presentation, I'm going to first briefly summarize that earlier webinar, and then Greg is going to present an additional 10 commonly reported non-conforming items. So our list of common potholes to avoid currently stands at 20. And the object of this exercise is, of course, to make it easier for your company to obtain the Holy Grail for a QCP project. And that's what you see in this slide here, and that is the project certificate. And for those of you who have executed a QCP project, you know that that can sometimes be a very handy thing to have when it comes time to get paid. In our earlier webinar, the first item we covered was project registration. And the relevant point here is that the percentage of QCP projects registered by the architect is relatively low. And if the job has not been registered by anyone at the time that you are awarded the subcontract, then the woodworker who won the contract is required by QCP policies to register the project immediately. And most of you know, I'm sure, registration is free and that can be done online. And registration generates a unique QCP project number, and that is necessary in order for you to take the next step, which is required, and that is to actually order certification for the project. This is a step where your company orders labels if it needs labels, or certificates which attest to the job's conformance with the contract documents and the AWS where the standards apply. If the project is one that requires inspection by a QCP rep, then labels and certificates are withheld until the inspection process is completed and any instances of reported non-conformances are resolved in whatever fashion that takes. Of course, ordering certification is the step during which the certification fee is paid. The required time, according to the policies, as you see on the slide here, is at least 14 days prior to commencement of fabrication. And that holds true even for licensee companies which are qualified to self-certify projects. And the reason that lead time still holds is because there are circumstances under which a project inspection may be required even if your company is self-certifying. If a company does not order certification until after the millwork is shipped or perhaps 95% installed, and an inspection is required, then certification, or at least full certification of that project, could be jeopardized. And again, on this slide, you see the relevant policy citations regarding this step in the process. And you will see that repeated failure to meet this requirement to register a project has been a factor in QCP revocation in a number of cases. Those of you who have been involved with inspected certified projects are aware that the very first thing the inspector will ask you for is specifications and your shop drawings prior to showing up at your plant or job site. And that is because QCP does offer a review of your shop drawings, and our review is very different in purpose than the architect's review. Really what we're looking for are drawing details or information which may be missing or which appear not to be in conformance with the specifications of the AWS. And we do this really as a convenience for you, since, of course, issues identified at the drawing stage are going to be a lot easier to correct than issues if they're first detected after a machining and or assembly has taken place. However, it is a cardinal rule for us that if our drawing review would in any way impede the project schedule, then we simply don't do the drawing review in many cases. Secondly, regarding shop drawings, there is a misconception which comes up periodically during QCP project inspections, and here's an example of that. Let's say that a certified project specification requires that some HPDL cabinet interiors be clad with a particular vertical grade laminate. And let's also say that white melamine is your customary finish for plastic cabinet interiors. So you decide that's what you're going to show on your shop drawings. And let's say you submit your drawings to the architect. He or she does his review, and the drawings are stamped indicating general approval of the drawings. And as you can see from the policy citations here, although your melamine cabinet interiors are part of that approved drawing, that change has in fact not been approved because there is not an additional specific written acceptance from the architect of your suggested change. And if that project were inspected and a QCP representative noted the disparity between the specifications and the shop drawing and your cabinet interiors, that would be a non-conforming item relative to the project specifications, and that might be a significant issue if you're pretty far down the line with your project. This is a somewhat typical architect stamp of reviewed drawings, and it kind of echoes that concept. Says corrections or comments made on the shop drawing review on the shop drawings during this review do not relieve contractor from compliance with requirements of the drawings and specifications. Similarly, in the AWS, in section 1 on page 27, it says changes to material or design must be specifically identified in separate written documentation within the submittal package requesting approval of the suggested changes. So you can use the drawing to request the change if that's properly done, or you could use an email or some other separate document. And I will also just briefly mention that if you compare the requirements in Edition 2 versus Edition 1 of the AWS, there are a few more requirements for the drawing, what must be included in the drawing reflecting those kinds of changes that you might request from the architect. Now we are into the first 10 most frequently reported non-conforming fabrication and installation items. First item is fasteners for captured cabinet backs. This first issue, of course, is a fabrication item, and fasteners are required for cabinet backs. The particular issue you see in this photograph relates to the edges of the back that are captured by dados in the cabinet box. And despite being captured, stapling and nailing at a maximum of 4 inches on center is required to lock that part of the back into the groove. And edges of backs which are not captured are to be screwed to the cabinet body component that is available for that, and those also need to be at 4 inches on center maximum. And I will mention that we have seen wall cabinets in which the required staples were present, apparently, in a captured back, but the staples did not actually penetrate the cabinet sides, either because they were too short or were not correctly shot through the back. And with the introduction of sufficient weight, that resulted in some cases in a failure of the joint between the cabinet top and sides when there was enough weight in it. And so the whole cabinet slid off the back onto the floor, but the back remained screwed to the wall. And those photographs are pretty impressive if you see them. Second item, cabinet anchoring to structural walls. Here we have an installed wall cabinet with its doors open. Our discussion of cabinet anchoring issues assumes that in-wall blocking is present in the building's structural walls. And in this slide, at least 2 fasteners at top and 2 at bottom, and no more than 16 inches on center are required for cabinet anchoring. They should be spaced at no more than 16 inches on center. All fasteners located horizontally and vertically should be within 3 inches of the outside surface of the end panels and or top and bottom panels. Item 3 is door and drawer alignment, flushness, and gaps between drawer fronts and doors. We all know that a project with any amount of casework is likely going to require final adjustment of doors and drawer fronts after installation. The AWS tolerances for the various parameters of that adjustment are in Section 10, and they appear as fabrication rules. And the casework installation standards at the end of Section 10 tell the reader to use the fabrication standards earlier in Section 10 for door and drawer front adjustments at the job site. This photograph is from a project inspected in 2014, and the drawer bodies were about 1/4 of an inch out of square, and consequently the applied drawer fronts throughout the whole project are in kind of a sawtooth type of configuration, so that one drawer front end sticks out about 3/8 inch from the adjacent end of the next drawer front. In other words, the drawer fronts are badly out of plane, not only with each other, but also with the doors below. And a project-wide issue like this would obviously have to be corrected before certification could be considered for that project. Inspectors are not looking for absolute perfection when they're looking at drawer front and door adjustment, especially on larger projects where there could be hundreds or thousands of doors and drawer fronts. What they do look for, I'm not saying they won't take some measurements and, spot check the actual dimensions and alignment, whether they're in plane and so on, but what they do look for is what the standards call an overall impression of first-class workmanship. But when there is a systematic and very repetitive issue like the one that we see here, that's a whole different story and something that would make a project ineligible for certification unless corrected. Item 4 is spacing of assembly wood dowels. The dowel must be a minimum of 5/16 in diameter and 1 inch 3/16 long. There is no limit set on maximum diameter or length of a dowel, so beyond the minimum requirements, it's your call as to what the dowel size is going to be. And the AWS states that if wood dowels are used for case construction, they must be glued, and the cases must be clamped. and that could be done with actual clamps or perhaps with generic assembly screws of some kind. A wood dowel joint must have a minimum of 2 dowels per joint. You can see in this photograph here in those stretchers on the right, woodworker felt more comfortable with 3, but 2 is the minimum. In case you may not have already noticed, there are important differences in case dowel placement requirements between the AWS Edition 2 versus Edition 1. And I won't go into a lot of detail here about those differences, but we will give you information at the end of today's presentation on where you can find all of our recorded previous webinars, including the one that dealt with these 10 non-conforming items. And those have all of the details on these differences. This is spacing of cabinet body dowel screws. As with the wood screws, there are differences, Edition 1 versus Edition 2. Item 5, sealing sink cutouts. It's another issue that comes up often. Usually it's not a case of 1 or 2 sink cutouts that have been missed. Typically, if one sink cutout is not sealed, we find that none of the sink cutouts on the job have been sealed, and that would, of course, require correction prior to project certification. If the sealer used for the sink cutouts is color-toned, as mentioned in the standard, that's great because it's hard to see cutout edges once the sink is installed, but frankly, inspectors are primarily concerned with whether there is sealer there at all. One sealant that many companies use that works great is just plain old silicone or caulk with a high silicone content. And, of course, a lot of installers already carry that around with them, and in a pinch can be applied with a finger. If a plumber is cutting the sink cutouts, hopefully something in the project documents will specify who is responsible for sealing the cutouts. If it's a project with dozens of sinks and edge sealing, that's important. And if it's ambiguous, an RFI might help clarify that. If the sink edges were not sealed because the woodworker contends it's not part of its contract, then if the project were inspected, the inspector would probably ask to see some supporting documentation for that. Item 6, cladding for p-lam doors and drawer fronts. This is another item that comes up very often. Cladding on the inside faces of p-lam doors and applied drawer fronts shall be the same thickness as the cladding on the outside face, which is the requirement for custom grade, and additionally shall be the same color and or pattern as the outside face, and that's the requirement for premium grade. Often doors and drawer fronts we see have melamine or cabinet liner on their backs, and neither of those are allowed if the front face is vertical grade or horizontal grade laminate. And unless it's specified that that's okay, you would need written permission from the designer or owner's representative to allow melamine or cabinet liner, and that's another thing an inspector might ask for. Item 7, wall scribe maximum widths. Per the standards, there must be closure at all visible voids. A scribe filler of the sort you see at this wall here shall not exceed 1.5 inches in width, and that applies to both custom and premium grade. Item 8 is edge banding for cabinet bodies, doors, and so forth. From time to time, we see a project, our inspectors see a project with edge banding specifications which are just simply missed by the manufacturer. And since edge banding usually takes place early in the process, it can be costly to correct the error if it's gone too far. And in particular, specification of some kind of decorative laminate or maybe 3mm banding as opposed to PVC tape for p-lam casework is often missed. And we recently inspected one project where we may have been able to detect that particular error during our shop drawing review, but the materials list that is required to convey that material on the shop drawing was missing, so we did not have an opportunity to point that out. Item 9, closure provision is required at all voids. Let's assume that we've got wall cabinets here with no soffit panels above, as in the photograph. Voids between a structural wall and a wall cabinet must be closed not only at the cabinet front, but also at its top and underside. In the general information at the beginning of Section 10 in the AWS, it says that a cabinet topside more than 80 inches above the finished floor is considered concealed and therefore non-visible unless it can be seen from a stairway, mezzanine, or some other vantage point above. That means voids at many cabinet tops are non-visible, like the one you see in this slide, and therefore the material for the closure is the manufacturer's choice, but that void does need to be closed. Again, for more detailed discussion of this particular point, you can refer to our earlier archived webinar. This illustrates another void at the top of a wall cabinet which requires closing. Item 10, if wall cabinet ends extend below the bottom of the wall cabinet, the interior exposed surfaces of the ends must be of a finish compatible in the case of custom grade or identical in the case of premium grade with the cabinet's other exposed surfaces such as the cabinet doors. This is an item that is not officially on the first 10 list. If transparent finish wood veneer wall paneling is part of a project's scope, it seems to often not conform with specifications and standards. And anyone who offers this as a product knows that there's a lot of moving parts with veneer specification, and this item has regularly become a significant issue in certified projects. We did dedicate an entire webinar to this a little while back. That webinar is also in the archive. So that completes the first 10 items, and I'm going to turn things over to QCP's inspection manager, Greg Parham, now to fill us in on the most recent 10 items.
Okay, thank you, Wayne. Hope everybody can hear me. If not, please let me know. So let's go on to the second 10 of our top 20. So item 11, wall cabinet top edges banding is required. This is an item that we're seeing more and more, and I just want to point out that this actual requirement was also present during the first edition, so it's really not something new to the second edition. The requirement itself states that if open above, however not visible at 80 inches or more above the floor, the edge is to be edge banded with the manufacturer's choice of edge material. Now, we do have a lot of times woodworkers will say, well, if it's 80 inches above, it's considered a concealed surface, which according to what standards say, that is true. However, the standard also has specific requirements for this, as noted above in Section 10, and that edge has to be edge banding. The key word here is the open above and not visible. And I would like to also point out to everybody that we did actually have a woodworker, as those of you in QCP, there's always the opportunity to appeal a decision that we made. This issue was actually appealed to the Board of Directors, and the Board of Directors chose to uphold the requirement. Item 12, anchor strip fastening. When the back panels are sandwiched, as shown in the photograph here, that makes that portion of the back, even though it's captured on the two sides and even the bottom into a groove, that upper portion, because of the sandwich, is considered a plant-on back. And per the standards, it is required that it be screwed to the case body at a maximum of 4 inches on center. A lot of times what we're seeing is woodworkers are using staples to attach it, but they're not doing the screws on the proper spacing. Anchorage screws. We're going to talk about anchorage screws in a couple locations during this presentation. But this is one that has been popping up over and over. In the first edition, anchorage screws merely said it was to have a surface-bearing head. There was no definition of what a surface-bearing head was, so as inspectors, we were rather lenient in what we allowed as a surface-bearing head. In the second edition, there is a clear definition of a surface-bearing head. The definition states that it is a screw with a homogeneous head that has a flat bottom surface at least 2 times the diameter of the screw shaft, and when tightened, distributed pressure on the surfaces being screwed. Screws and washers are not considered surface-bearing heads for the purpose of this standard. So as you can see in the photos there, the upper one with the angle head and the finish washer, or the beauty washer as some people call it, is not an acceptable surface-bearing head anchorage screw. The other two, the pan head and the larger, what's often referred to as a cabinet installation screw nowadays, are acceptable. There are also some others out there that I didn't have to be able to take a photograph of, known as a power. One is called the power head, the other is called the truss head. But those type of screws will be acceptable and considered surface-bearing heads. Item 14, base cabinet fastening to the loose base. We're seeing this missed multiple times in a lot of projects. Under the requirement and the standards, base cabinets not mechanically fastened to the loose toe kick, the countersunk flathead screws is required. In the standard, it says separate bases are not required to be anchored to the floor. However, they are required to be attached to the cabinet bottom with flathead screws set flush or slightly recessed to prevent their movement. Now, one thing you will note, the standard does not establish any particular spacing or number of screws. So as you see in this photograph, the woodworker opted to use one screw in the front right corner, and that would be acceptable. Item 15, drawer fronts to sub-front fastener spacing. Again, this is something that we see far too frequently, and hopefully this webinar will help to end that. So the standard requires that the front must be attached with a minimum of 2 screws at each end and a maximum of 1.5 inches from the inside corner of the drawer box. Just so as you can see here, they didn't have the 2 screws. They were also not within the distance that's required. In addition, the standard goes on to say that the fasteners be a maximum of 12 inches on center. But it also allows the screws to be used for drawer pulls to be considered a fastener for the on-center requirement. So on the majority of drawers in your projects, if you have your 2 screws to the outside within the 1.5 inches of the inside corners, and then you have your drawer pull, you're typically going to hit the on-center requirement. Next, item 16. On open cabinet, the anchorage fasteners are required to have fastener cover caps. Now, with the requirement for surface-bearing heads, this has caused a bit of a problem. Sometimes we do run into situations where the architect doesn't like it, and if we're informed of that, then we allow other alternatives. But also, a lot of woodworkers say, well, you're requiring me to use these surface-bearing heads. How are we going to cover those? In those situations, we make these following suggestions. These are examples of fastener cover caps that we've seen on inspections. There are several options in the marketplace. There are the 2-part plastic caps or the hinge caps as shown. But I will also note that there really is no restriction on countersinking the head, but you do need to consider that if you decide to go that route, the fact that you may reduce the holding power depending upon the thickness of the head. There are also some of these newer screws. I know one brand name is Powerhead. I'm not endorsing it, but that is just one of the names out there. There's also a truss head. And there are companies that provide specialty bits that will allow you to just countersink these slightly and maintain the flat surface. And then you can put an adhesive cover cap on them. Item 17, the drawer box back is more than 2 inches from the cabinet back. In the standards, the requirement is that it has to be within 2 inches of the interior surface of the cabinet back, and that is what we measure. Now, there are always going to be those times that that additional space is required for a wire chase, or the cabinet itself is designed to be 30 inches deep or something like that, and there's not a drawer slide that's available that will allow you to get within the distance. If that is brought up to our attention, we can accept that. But oftentimes we find that companies, we run into companies that, well, they just like a certain length of drawer slide, and so they keep their drawers that way, and then we go in to inspect them and find that they're more than the 2 inches that's allowed in the standards. French cleat used for installation of wall cabinets. This we see all across the country. A lot of companies do this, and then we come in and we inspect and find it and have to inform them, unfortunately, that's not permitted. What the standard states is that a locking cleat or French cleat is not an approved method for anchorage of a wall cabinet unless it has been independently tested to meet their structural integrity test shown in the standards. If it has been tested, QCP requires a copy of the testing in order to accept it as a method of anchorage. Now, what we do tell companies when we do see this is that you can still use the cleat as an anchorage system without testing, but it's really only being used as a method of location. So we appreciate the fact that sometimes it's easier and faster to put up a cleat, drop your cabinet on it, and go from there. But in order for it to meet the standards, you would have to go back in and put in the anchorage fasteners in the proper location and spacing, as was discussed earlier. Now, you always have the option, again, of getting permission from the architect to allow you to use a French cleat system. But that needs to occur before we come in and see it being used, or it would prevent the project from being fully certified. Next item is incorrect adjustable shelf thickness. Typically when we see this issue, it has more to do with where the shelves are going. In the standards, if the project is a commercial project, the requirement of load capacity is 40 pounds per square foot. If it is a school, hospital, or library, the requirement for load capacity is 50 pounds per square foot. So what we're finding a lot of times is people are missing the fact that you need to use the higher load capacity when you're looking at the standards and determining what size the shelf should be. So it's important that you pay very close attention to exactly what your load capacity is, and also pay attention to what you're making the shelves out of, because between the load capacity and the construction of the shelf determines the final thickness of the shelf requirement. And back to anchorage fasteners. The 20th most common nonconformity is having the wrong size of an anchorage fastener. The standards are clear that you need a minimum of a 3-inch length and a number 10 diameter. We are seeing a lot of companies, just as shown in this photograph, with 2.5 inches. The standard does require a 3-inch length. And that is the end of the presentation. I will go ahead and point out here that these items The recording of the webinar will be available on the resources page on our home page, and we will also be posting the top 20 non-conformities spreadsheet on there also, so you can print that out at your leisure and have it to use as a checklist.
Thanks, Craig. For more information on upcoming AWI events, please visit our website at awInet.org.